Welcome back. So we finished up right here on the last one with the United States going to war. We talked about the beginning of World War I last time. We talked about the U.S.'s neutrality at the beginning of World War I. But after the Zimmerman telegram in Germany trying to start a fight between Mexico and the U.S., we couldn't ignore it any longer. And on April the 6th, 1917, Congress declares war on Germany and its allies, and President Wilson signs the declaration. You can see the Seattle Star newspaper here, but basically any newspaper in the country would look very much like this. War has begun today, Wilson signs declaration, show your colors, very patriotic, and we'll get to the war in a second. But first, let's take a look at what's going on in the home front. So pretty much immediately after we declare war, right? We declare war April the 6th, 1917. Not very long after, a few months after, we sign the Espionage Act of 1917, and then a year later, the Sedition Act of 1918. And both of these are generally kind of considered in the same space, in the same area as each other. On the STAR test, you're not going to see an Espionage Act and then a Sedition Act question. You're going to see one question that talks about both of them. So that's the good news. You're not going to need to know exactly which law does which thing here. Just understand sort of the two of them together combine to do, well, this. It's illegal to talk about, print, or broadcast on radio or television any messages that could harm the United States, especially during wartime. This poster over here, featuring Ben Franklin, is a warning to printers, like anybody that could, if you print pamphlets or books or posters or anything, if you start printing anti-American stuff, you might end up arrested. And I mean, they'll try and get the person who was trying to get you to print it, and you might be able to get a lower sentence if you gave them up. But, it actually made it illegal to put out sort of things that would be harmful to the government. Wilson believed, that this was a necessary thing to do to make sure that a bunch of pro-German, Americans, remember last time we talked about there's a lot of Americans were wanting to get on the war on the side of Germany. And he didn't want them organizing and printing and doing all kinds of things. Remember, they didn't have like the internet or social media or anything back then. So if you wanted to get your message out, you had to get it on posters, on pamphlets, and books, and magazines, and newspapers, and actually distribute it. Or you could get on the radio. That was, radio had been around for a little bit, but television was, or these movie reels was very new. There were a lot of lawsuits, that First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of a lot of things. And it went before the Supreme Court more than once, and the Supreme Court ruled in the law's favor, said, no, this law is constitutional. This is an acceptable limit on a citizen's freedom of speech. And the entire Espionage and Sedition Acts aren't still around in 2020, but a lot of it is. A lot of this stuff is still technically illegal. We haven't really prosecuted people on it in a while, but technically it's illegal. So we declared war, sure, April 1917. The thing is, we don't have a very big army at the moment. We have the Spanish-American War. We definitely have an army. We have a pretty strong navy, but like an actual land force of an army, we don't have a lot of people. So about a month after war is declared, President Wilson signs the draft, the Selective Service Act, May 18th, 1917. You don't need to know the date exactly, but definitely know the Selective Service Act of 1917. Any man aged 21 to 30 had to report to the military. And that gets our military up to 10 million people, which is a pretty good sizable fighting force for the time. And, pardon. The Selective Service Act is still around in 2020. When you turn 18, gentlemen, you have to sign up for the draft. Now, we haven't had a draft since I think Vietnam was the last one because it was super unpopular. We probably won't ever have a draft again. We have a big enough volunteer army today in 2020, but you will need to sign up for the Selective Service Act, and you won't be able to get college grants, loans, or anything like that to go to college without having signed up. Ladies, I think you're still exempt. I don't think you have to do it. There have been a few lawsuits around this. It's possible you'll have to do it in the future. But currently, I don't think you have to. And so that's still around. And so this brings our military up to 10 million soldiers, which is a whole lot. But they're not a professional soldier. We're not a bunch of professional soldiers yet. So we have General John Pershing. He's our sort of head of the military going into World War I. And I know we've had some pretty rough nicknames for generals in history class lately, Butcher Wieland being one of them. But John Pershing, his nickname was Blackjack. He was General John Blackjack Pershing, which is just a cool nickname. Like if you're fighting on the side of a war and your general's nickname is Blackjack, that's kind of cool. Not gonna lie. So he realizes that these 10 million soldiers, it's a whole lot of soldiers, which is great. It's what the country needs. But they're not experienced. They don't have any combat training. They don't have any combat experience. The nickname they get are doughboys because they're doughy and not tough yet. So Pershing puts together a training program, it's not exactly how boot camp goes today, but it's certainly where a lot of the ideas for our modern boot camp come from. And it was learning how to use weapons, physical fitness, all that stuff put together. And so by June of 1917, right, so April we declare war, May we put in the draft, June we have not all 10 million of our soldiers, but we have a lot of our soldiers ready to go by June of 1917. And they kept the nickname Doughboys. That was kind of their, sort of taking that word and kind of making it their own. Probably wouldn't, I don't know. Sorry, I was about to make a point. I wasn't sure if it was true, so I'm not going to do it. But yeah, so that was kind of their nickname. Is at the beginning they were kind of doughy. Now they're tough and ready, but they're still going to call themselves Doughboys. And one of the things that Pershing did when he got American troops to France, a very good thing that General John Pershing did when he got American troops to France, is he refused to give a single American soldier to the French to command, because the French were so excited to see more soldiers. They were just going to order them to charge straight into the machine gun fire. And Pershing was like, no, you don't get to command my troops. I'll command my troops. And so the American units were kind of kept sort of separate, not allowed to be put under French or British generals. They could only be commanded by American generals. So what's going on the home front? Well, we have a full war economy going into World War I. Going into World War I, we were basically one of the strongest economies. After Europe had been blowing each other up and killing a bunch of each other for a couple of years before we get involved, our economy is definitely the strongest one. But it's building stuff like, consumer goods, stuff for people to buy for the home, appliances, clothing, furniture, etc. And now we need to switch it over to guns and ammunition and explosives and bombs and all the things we need to make a war. And that takes a little while, but once it does, we start cranking out just a wild amount of war material for our soldiers. And the soldiers that go over, a lot of those jobs that they had get taken over by women. And this is going to happen again in World War II. This is a pretty common thing during war, is the men go fight and the women take over these jobs. The other big thing that sort of helped fund the war effort, right? Our giant full war economy, changing over all of our factories, everything else. I remember seeing a picture of a bumper, what do they call it? basically like it was a whole like campaign, like an advertising campaign for people to rip their metal bumpers off their cars and turn that metal into the scrap metal for the war effort. And then I think they're supposed to put like some, just like kind of tape, like a styrofoam thing to the, I forget, I'd have to look it up. But yeah, like that's how much the economy was going in. The other half of how we funded our war effort, other than the economy just switching over entirely to funding the war, is Liberty bonds or USA bonds or war bonds, or a lot of different names, right? But if you see like war or Liberty or USA or whatever bonds, what that was the U.S. borrowing money. So if you bought a war bond, like let's say it was $100, you would go to like the post office or the bank where they would kind of sell these, and you would buy a piece of paper for $100, and that was a war bond. It was an IOU from Uncle Sam that at the end of the war will pay you back $100. You give us $100 now so we can fight the war. After the war, we'll pay you your $100 back with like a little bit of interest. And it was kind of seen as sort of patriotic to buy these in the first place. But it was also sort of seen as patriotic that if you could afford not to like turn it in at the end of the war to get paid back, then like that was an even bigger patriotic thing. So like there's definitely stories you see of not so much these days, but definitely when I was younger, when as people that were alive during World War I passed away, they got old and they passed away, and their kids would go through all of their stuff. They would find these war bonds from World War I that had never been turned in because they thought it was their patriotic duty. Like, no, I bought these not to lend the government money. I was just giving them money for the war. So, and as you can tell, the ad campaigns are all over the place. This is in a Boy Scout magazine. Third Liberty Loan Campaign, Boy Scouts of America. And that's a really cool painting, I'm not going to lie, at all. I think that's just really cool. Now, for anyone that's worried that this kid is grabbing that sword by the blade, don't worry about it. Swords that size traditionally were not very sharp. They relied on their weight and gravity and momentum to do its damage. Just that big overhead swing, like that kind of, it doesn't need to be sharp is what I'm saying. So he's probably fine holding it like that. Now, when Lady Liberty sort of takes it from him, she needs to take it carefully, and he needs to hand it over carefully, otherwise he could lose some fingers. But yeah, I think that's just a, super cool ad. All right, back to the front, back to the war effort. One of the things that you hear, a phrase that you hear a lot when you talk about war is war is hell, right? And I've never been in a war, but I 100% trust that that's true. But as a history teacher and studying all these different wars that we teach about in class, and other ones just, because, I've kind of noticed that like each war has its own sort of special kind of hell that it is. And World War I, that was trench warfare. Now, trench warfare came about because of two pieces of technology. The first was the modern machine gun. Now, the modern machine gun had been used in plenty of battles before World War I, but it was always somebody with a modern machine gun versus somebody without. The British putting down the Zulu rebellion in Africa, the Boer War in South Africa. It was never like machine gun versus machine gun. The closest we had was the American Civil War, but that was 50 years prior with 50-year-old technology, and even then it was an incredibly bloody conflict. And there were certainly most European generals and commanders didn't really consider this a problem, and they thought this was going to be a great showing, and we'd all be home by Christmas. But some people who really studied it kind of noticed with the American Civil War, even with the very early model machine guns we had access to in the American Civil War, how quickly they could kill people. And they were horrified by what might happen with modern machine guns against each other in these battles. And they were right to be horrified, because when Germany and France meet for the first time on the battlefield of Verdun, 20,000 men are killed in the first hour. So the machine guns and the artillery, the launching bombs and stuff across, they dug these trenches. So because of the machine gun fire, because of the artillery, they dig trenches into the dirt because, well, you can't really shoot a machine gun through the dirt to hit somebody. So if you can, kind of hunker down, duck down, and only poke up to return fire, then you're only vulnerable for a second or two, and chances are good they're not going to be able to hit, your head sticking out of a hole. You'll probably be okay. Unless you're not, but, probably. And they put these things of barbed wire out front. Now, barbed wire we didn't really use in the American Civil War as like a weapon, but we know the effectiveness of it because of the, cattle and the ranch wars and stuff. You remember that in Texas history. So, like, you have these months-long battles, right, where if you have these two trenches and the two sides are sort of shooting back and forth at each other, sending artillery, and then, let's say this side gets chased out of their trench. Well, they pop out of their trench, they go back to the next one in their line, and these guys come up and take over this trench, and then the fighting starts again. And what will probably happen is these guys will have to retreat back to their original trench, and these guys get to come back to their original trench, and maybe, they kind of just keep going back and forth like this over the course of months and months and months. And it might take months to capture even 100 yards of territory, and just tens of thousands of lives lost over these tiny little bits of territory. So that's the machine guns and the artillery. That's what causes trench warfare, because you need protection from the machine gun and the artilleries, and right now trenches are your option. So what happens because of trench warfare? Poison gas and tanks. So poison gas is incredibly effective for two reasons in World War I. One, look at these gas masks. They are not good. They're not in good shape. They're not going to be helpful. Sorry. And they really weren't. They were very poor quality. They didn't really help a whole lot at all. The other reason why poison gas was so effective is because it's heavier than air. So that means it's going to you spray it out and then it's going to kind of settle, right? And in a normal conflict where people are running at each other and it kind of settles down, eventually, you get above it and you're fine. But if you're in a trench and you're like under the ground and they just send a huge wave of the gas cloud above you, well, it's all going to settle into the trench. And you're going to either need to stay in the trench, where your gas mask probably won't save you and you could very easily die because of this gas, or you can jump out of the trench and probably get mowed down by machine gun fire. Your choice. So poison gas is incredibly effective, and eventually, after World War I, we certainly try and ban sort of some early international treaties and law. We try and ban the use of poison gas warfare in international war. It's actually a thing that Adolf Hitler was a soldier in World War I on the German side, and his unit was actually hit with poison gas. And talking about it later in life, he's like, we need to ban this. We need to, no more poison gas in warfare. But then he ordered 6 million Jewish people and 5 million people of other groups that were trying to get rid of and hated, killed with poison gas. So, anyway. The other big weapon, the other big innovation were tanks. Now these, air quote, tanks, right? They were used to try and break through trenches. They were not very good. They were not very fast. They didn't have big giant, when you think of tanks today, these things are massive. They have guns on them. They can shoot explosive shell, all kinds of things these modern tanks can do. That's tanks in World War I. you can kind of ride on them, and a couple people can ride in them, and usually that would protect you from machine gun fire. And the treads could usually kind of get over barbed wire and even sometimes over trenches. So they weren't great like weapons, but they could get you close enough to a trench to sort of break that stalemate sometimes. And then, when the Americans joined the war, they bring shotguns to help clear out the trenches. And Germany gets really mad about that because they think that's horribly unfair and cruel. So, but that's not the one. We don't really talk about shotguns on the STAR test. STAR test, talk about barbed wire, machine guns, trench warfare, tanks, and poison gas. That's usually what shows up on the STAR test. So the U.S. kind of gets involved. We end up with one of the lower casualty rates of all the people involved because we show up so late, and that's, I think, one of the good things about Wilson keeping us out of the war for so long. But the beginning of the end for Germany, this is the turning point in the war, right? So before this, Germany is advancing slowly into France, slowly into Russia, until, and again, this is U.S. history. This doesn't affect a ton of U.S. history yet. But they get Russia out of the war by sending Vladimir Lenin, who's once a communist revolution in Russia. They put him back on a train because he was chilling in Berlin. They put him back on a train and they send him into Russia because he'd been exiled. And so when he gets back to Russia, he helps whip up the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. We talked about that last year in world history. But they'd been kind of advancing into Russia and taking some territory. They definitely were taking territory in France. And this isn't the first battle that the Americans get there for. We've been there for about a year now. But we finally sort of break the German line in the Argonne Forest. American forces, French forces, and British forces sort of like begin to win the war, right? They start pushing back against the Germans. And the German high command basically looks at the situation and like they're winning. On paper, they're winning. They've captured territory, they're holding it, but they know how many troops they have left. They know how many bullets they have left. And they realize that if, we just get another all-out assault like what happened in the Argonne Forest, the German army is going to just shatter. There's nothing left. They have very few bullets left. They have very few men left. They can barely hold on to what they have right now. If there's a concentrated attack, again, like the Battle of Argonne Forest, where there were gas attacks, machine gun, all the things. This is a photograph from there. What's left of the forest, right? If there's another massive battle like that, the German high command knows that the German army is done for. So they tell the civilian leadership of Germany, you need to go surrender. We're done. We're out. We can't do this anymore. And so the civilian, I forget the guy's name, but he goes to deliver the surrender to the Allies, and then we put together the Treaty of Versailles on November the 11th, 1918, 11/11 at 11 a.m. because they wanted to make it all fancy. So on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, this war has come to an end. And these days, in a lot of countries around the world, that's Armistice Day. Armistice meaning like peace treaty. We used to celebrate Armistice Day on November 11th, but now we celebrate Veterans Day on November 11th in America. There was a changeover period, I don't know, after Korea or Vietnam maybe, where we changed it from just Armistice Day about World War I to just all veterans from all of our wars. Because obviously all the veterans from all of our wars should be recognized for what they did and what it cost them. So now that the war is over, right? Peace treaty's been signed. Germany has surrendered unconditionally, and the Allies, the Entente, the Triple Entente, right? America, France, England, not so much Russia anymore. They sort of had a revolution and murdered the Tsar, and it's the Bolsheviks take over. I mean, they still kind of show up, right? They all kind of get together, and Woodrow Wilson comes with a very like forward-thinking plan. And it's kind of like, you remember, like, this is one of our most, other than the slave-owning presidents, other than Andrew Jackson and maybe one or two others, Woodrow Wilson's one of the most racist presidents we had. He really like helped the KKK get back on their feet. And like, what's so frustrating about that, other than just like, why would you do that, man, is like, clearly he's very forward thinking. Clearly he can look to the future and sort of see what the effect actions are going to have going further down the road. Obviously he's not like psychic or anything, but he's just like, you know, he's able to kind of look at a situation and kind of see what's going to happen down the road because of it. And if he had like used that to try and like help heal the racial divide in America instead of trying to get the KKK back together, I'm not saying he could have fixed racism in the US, but like, gosh, he could have helped. Anyway, that's not going to be on the test. That's just my opinion, which just happens to be right. Sorry, what was that? So his 14-point peace plan, the good news is you're not going to need to memorize all 14 points. You can look them up if you want. You don't need to memorize them. What you need to know is the gist of his 14-point peace plan. The main idea, the thesis statement of the 14-point peace plan is that this war is nobody's fault. Everyone's going to go back to what they were before the war. Everyone's going to give their territory back. Reset button. This was everybody's fault. Nobody is going to get punished for starting the war. Everyone, we're giving everything back. We're going back to how it was before the war, and we're going to help each other rebuild. No more secret alliances. That was a huge, remember the chart? None of that anymore. Free trade among nations. You can buy and sell from us, and you can buy and sell from us, and you can buy and sell from us. You can all buy and sell from us. You know, money. You got to give the conquered lands back. We're going to create a nation called Poland. We're going to take some land from Russia. We're going to take some land from Germany, and we're going to go ahead and remake Poland. Poland's kind of existed a few times in history, and then Germany or Russia or both sort of like conquer that territory, and then it's a whole thing. But in this case, we're creating Poland very much on purpose to basically to give Germany and Russia like a minute to chill out, please. I will turn this car around kind of energy. And he also wants to create the League of Nations, which is his crowning achievement. Now, the main idea, remember, is nobody's punished for this war, because he knew the victors, England and France, would want to punish Germany. And he's like, don't do it. Don't do it. It's going to cause problems later on. And he was right. You know, Hitler and the Nazis and World War II. But his big thing was the League of Nations. He really wanted the League of Nations. He really wanted a group of nations that would get together and we could talk about our problems and we could fix it and we could solve things before they become a war. And pretty much immediately, England and France throw away most of the 14 points. They're going to blame Germany. They're going to punish Germany. And they're going to force Germany to pay this huge war debt. Basically, all the money that England and France lost in the war, Germany's going to have to pay them back. And it was just this enormous unpayable amount. Germany eventually does pay them back. I think in 2014 or 2015, they finally finished paying them back. I mean, you were alive. Whenever it was, you were alive for it. That's how long it took. Because it was such a wild amount, just impossible for Germany to ever pay back. And we got the Great Depression coming up, so that's going to make that even worse. Now, Wilson did get 2 of his points. I mean, maybe a couple of the other small ones, but his 2 main points that did get accepted were the creation of Poland in between Germany and Russia, so they could like chill out for a minute and stop fighting. I will turn them. You get it. And they also formed the League of Nations, which is like, Wilson was like, great, we can work on the other stuff through the League of Nations. We can make this happen. And so he goes back to America, to the Senate, because he's got to get the Senate to ratify the treaty. And the Senate says, no, we're out of this. Washington was right. Don't get involved with these European nations. Look how many Americans died in the war. We're done. We're back to isolationist. We're out. And so Wilson isn't really able to get that fixed or changed. So the U.S. stays out of the League of Nations. And the League of Nations, the whole point of the League of Nations, the whole point of having a place where all these people can come together and talk and work things out and make deals and sign treaties, is to prevent another world war. And obviously the League of Nations fails because World War II happens basically 30 years. Is it even 30 years? Yeah, like 25 years, like not even 30 years later. 25 years, something like that. And so the League falls, the League fails. But the sort of silver lining to that is after World War II, we formed the United Nations, and the USA does join that one, and we haven't had a world war since. Now, that's not just because of the United Nations. There's a lot of other reasoning for that, too, in the modern world. But, haven't had a world war since. Now, you might think, well, the United Nations, what do they even do? They're so ineffective. And maybe they are. But, haven't had a world war since. They might not be good for a lot else. But we haven't had a world war since. Speaking of world wars, World War II is coming very soon. Next unit, we're going to be talking about more of the Great Depression and sort of the lead up to World War II, but we'll be talking about World War II relatively soon, everybody. And when I'm given an opportunity like this to kind of foreshadow the next unit, when it's so obvious, when it's so, to some people it was so obvious what was going to happen. President Wilson was kind of one of them. Now, he didn't predict Nazis and Hitler exactly, but he knew that punishing Germany and throwing this weight on their economy and making it so they couldn't recover was going to lead to bad things down the road. And so very few of the large causes of World War I are ever actually fixed. Militarism is still a problem. The alliances are kind of fixed-ish, but there's still a lot of alliances happening. Imperialism is still a huge problem. Germany still doesn't have its empire. England and France do. They're making bank off of them. Germany's just losing more and more and more. And then nationalism only gets worse. So the four main causes, the only one that kind of gets fixed is alliances. The other three are still a huge problem. And Germany basically has to give all the money that they make as an economy to England and France to pay back that war debt instead of helping rebuild Germany. And the Great Depression is about not even 10 years away at this point. Oh, no, actually about 10 years away. And then the Nazis take power in Germany in 1915, and man, you've probably already been looking at this picture, huh? Let me explain. Yes, that's George Washington. Yes, those are American flags. And yes, that's a swastika. Because remember, a lot of people before World War I in America were pretty pro-Germany. There's a lot in the lead up to World War II that are very much pro-Nazi Germany. And this picture is taken from a Nazi rally held in Madison Square Garden. Where the Knicks play, big concert venue these days. And this was in 1939. 20,000 American Nazis showed up in New York City for this event. There were more around the country. And we're going to have to talk about that. So, next time, take care. Have a great night.